Welcome to this edition of the High Strangeness Factor, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I am your host, Steve Ward. On the High Strangeness Factor, Andy Mercer and I have explored many aspects of the paranormal and unexplained, with interesting guests, researchers, investigators, and authors. We are now in our 5th year. Tonight, we have another great guest that I will introduce in just a moment. Andy Mercer cannot be with us tonight, but we have a return visit from Susy Bastille. Susy, welcome back to the High Strangeness Factor.
Hi, Steve. How's it going?
Really good. You were just here on as a guest, and now you're here as a guest co-host. I don't know if that's a sideways move or to go up in pay or down in pay. I will check.
I was going to ask if that was a promotion or a demotion. I'm not sure yet.
When we're done, I'll check with human resources. So anyway, it's great to have you back. And we want to let people know that your show has been up for a couple of weeks, I guess. And you discussed the infamous Bridgewater Triangle, the Hockomock Swamp, some of the critters that are supposed to have been seen there, like the puckwudgies and thunderbirds and so forth. And so I invite people to go back to the High Strangeness Factor on the Paranormal UK Radio Network and check that out. And also, you have a blog. Tell us what people can find your blog.
It's puckwudgies.blogspot.com.
Okay.
And I'm gonna spell puckwudgies because it's a rough one. It's PUKWUDGIES.
Very good.
Puckwudgies.blogspot.com is how you find me.
And also, you just put up if they go to your blog, can they find your YouTube video that you just put up?
Yep, absolutely. It's the newest post. There's a link to it.
And what's the name of the gentleman you interviewed?
Bill Russo, who is the infamous puckwudgie sighting from the Bridgewater Triangle documentary.
Okay, very good. And now you have been on several shows lately. Some are available and some will be available. You want to give us some idea of what people should look for to find those shows?
Yeah, I did Monsters on the Edge with Barnaby Jones, 222 Paranormal Podcast, Beyond the Woodline Podcast, and those are Monsters on the Edge and Beyond the Woodline are both videos on YouTube also. I just recorded an episode with Sasquatchers that will be coming out shortly. I'm not sure exactly when, but I believe next week.
Okay, which means that by the time this show airs, it might already be out.
It might be, yep.
Okay, that's just the way these things go. And also, you and I just did Mac Maloney's Military X-Files. And I'm not really sure when that'll be out. It'll probably be out by the time this one's out. So everybody just be alert and look around. Okay, and anything else going on that we should know about?
No, I think I have been busy lately. I'm sure I'm missing something, but I think...
Okay, we can always revisit it. So,
yeah.
So let's introduce our guest. Dean Bertram has a PhD in history from the University of Sydney, Australia. His doctoral dissertation was titled Flying Saucer Culture, a Historical Survey of American UFO Belief. His writings have been featured in a range of publications, including Fortean Times, People magazine, The Spectator, and The Australian. He hosts the podcast Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. Dean is also a filmmaker and film festival programmer. He runs Midwest Weird Fest and a Night of Horror International Film Festivals, both based in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And he is currently shooting a feature documentary about Raymond A. Palmer, the Shaver Mystery, and the birth of modern UFO belief titled The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers. Dean, welcome to the High Strangeness Factor.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. And it's great to meet you too, Susy.
Well, let's see. There's so much to cover. And by the way, it's been great being on your show a few times. So that's always been fun.
Oh, you're always one of my favorite guests, Steve. I love having you on.
Oh, I appreciate it. I think we're both kind of on the same wavelength. Now, I don't know if that's
Mhm.
good or bad, but we'll let Susie decide that later at the end of the show.
We'll do a return an exit interview, and I'll give you ratings at the end.
Oh, very good.
Fantastic.
Make sure Human Resources is on watching every minute. Let's see. I do want to get into you grew up in Australia, and at some point you came over this way, and you live up in the how far up in Wisconsin do you live?
I'm kind of in the center of the state. I mean, I say the North Woods. We're probably the base of the North Woods, but I'm in the middle of nowhere. I live in a cabin in the woods, and it's very different, obviously, to Sydney, Australia. But I love it here. I love the slower pace in lifestyle. It gives me more time to think and contemplate weird Fortean mysteries, I suppose.
Very good, a good place for it. Now you just got done with one of your film festivals, right?
Yeah, we just wrapped Midwest Weird Fest. It was the 8th Midwest Weird Fest, and this year I actually transported a festival that I founded in Sydney back in 2006 and have been running there ever since, called A Night of Horror International Film Festival. And I couldn't really run it adequately anymore. I mean, I was still going back when my daughter was first born, but it just became harder and harder to do. So I thought, rather than let people continue to kind of manage it there, I'll bring it here. So we ran that festival next to Midwest Weird Fest in a cinema with 2 screens, which was great. So we had both of the festivals running simultaneously, and it was just a spectacular year. So much fun.
So what happens at one of these festivals? What kind of films do we see, and what kind of a crowd do you have?
We have a really healthy crowd. I mean, it's wonderful because in a big city, people are so used to being like in Sydney, there was film festivals every week. Sometimes there was more than one. But in a city like Eau Claire, which is a small college town, which is where I run the festivals out of, the locals who are into that type of cinema, weird cinema, horror cinema, paranormal documentaries, they're, I think, super excited to have this type of event in their town. So over the years, more and more people have continued to come. So now I look into the audience and I recognize almost half of the faces as repeat people who've continued to come. And so a lot of people come with it. You can get very affordable season passes. And so, yeah, people come and they can enjoy a range, particularly at Midwest Weird Fest, which also has some horror content. But there's things like paranormal documentaries. We had a fantastic film this year called The UFOs of Soesterberg, which is about a very famous, perhaps the most important UFO wave and flap in the Netherlands. We had an incredible film from the UK called The Pocket Film of Superstitions, which is what it sounds like. It looks at an array of superstitions in a kind of irreverent tone and in a very dreamy, mesmerizing type manner, and then a wide range of independent small documentaries which are just shorts and various length other programs, and also a lot of just, I suppose, genre and speculative and underground type content. We had everything from neo-noir dark romances to a fantastic superhero comedy called Villains Inc., through to the type of films I mentioned to, nasty home invasion movies, so Midwest Weird Fest is a very broad tent. A Night of Horror, as the name suggests, is probably more focused on horror movies. But anybody who likes weird content, I think, is very happy and has a family at Midwest Weird Fest. And that's what we're like there with Midwest Weird Fest and Night of Horror. We really are a family. In fact, we're rated consistently on Film Freeway, which is the world's major film festival submission site. It's where filmmakers submit their films to film festivals. There's over 12,000 film festivals on Film Freeway. We're always in the top 100 filmmaker reviewed festivals, usually in the top 50 or higher. And that's out of 12,000 festivals around the planet, which goes to show how much filmmakers at least enjoy the festival.
Well, that's great. Now, these are all original entries.
Yeah, I program probably, and it's another reason I think the festival's popular, is I program probably almost 80 to 90% of the content from cold submissions. Occasionally I might source a film, or somebody who's a programming consultant might say, hey, Dean, you really need to see this movie. I saw it at another festival. But the vast majority are just filmmakers who submit. And while I've done retrospective films at both festivals in the past, usually the content is at least 95% brand new. This year, I don't think there was no retrospective content. So everything was brand new.
So do you have to review dozens and dozens of films to set up
Hundreds of films.
Uh,
I probably watched over 1,000 films for both festivals this year.
oh my God! But I
Hmm.
guess that's well, it could be fun, but a lot of very time consuming.
Well, I don't consume a whole lot of other content anymore because of it, you know. And as much as I love horror, it's funny when I do unwind, I'm not like I used to be, you know, 20 years ago. Let's throw in a horror movie because probably that week I already watched 10 horror movies. So it's not like unwinding in your downtime. But I mean, I can't complain. It's not like digging ditches. I'm blessed to be able to do this kind of work.
And the quality runs high.
Oh, the quality is amazingly high. I think a lot of times when people think about independent cinema, they think of, you know, it's especially horror movies, it's kids with a handy cam using tomato sauce to pretend that their best friend's been killed. And while you might get the occasional submission, which is actually that kind of film, the vast majority is just like something you'd see if you turned on, I don't know, Netflix or went to the cinema. But that said, it's very independent. So it's very fresh, it's very new. It's not something you're going to have any other chance of experiencing, perhaps for 6 months to a year outside of the festival experience. So audiences, for this example, this year we had, I think, 3 or 4 world premiere films, and those films will all go on to do, you know, bigger things and play elsewhere. But to be able to sit in an audience and know you're the first people in public to cast your eyes on this material, often with the director and or the producer and or cast and other cast and crew there to Q&A and to introduce the film, it is very different to an experience you get when you go to a Cineplex.
That's really cool. You're familiar, of course, with Bruce Campbell.
Oh, I love Bruce Campbell.
Yeah. Well, have you read his memoirs? If Chins Could Kill.
You
It
know,
is
I should have read it. I haven't, but I'm aware of it. I've got to read it one of these days.
it is so funny. And he grew up a little bit north. He grew up in the Detroit area, not too far from where I used to live. In fact, my sister brags that she rode the bus down to Wayne State University with Bruce Campbell's brother. Well, you know,
Oh, wow.
I can't beat that, I guess. But if Chins could kill, he talks about how he and Sam Raimi and Ted Raimi, they were all buddies together. They were always making these amateur films, and they even got them run at the local Royal Oak Theater, I guess. But it's just, and then it talks about how they created the first Evil Dead movies, and how they went to Tennessee because of the laws and the cheap rent or whatever, and they were learning how to do special effects by the seat of their pants. So I think that you would really enjoy that book. And he has a sequel too. But If Chins Could Kill is just a blast.
I'll hunt it down and read it. I love film memoirs, so I'm sure I'll enjoy Campbell's.
So when did you come? When did you leave Australia?
Well, I immigrated here in 2014 when I married my ex-wife. I'm obviously since divorced, and that's the reason I moved here, I guess, because of the woman I married. And then I had a child, which is probably why I'm still in the North Woods, although I do love it here. And basically that led to me eventually wanting to do festivals here. I'd already done them in Sydney for like over a decade. And so I launched Midwest Weird Fest here because I was like, hey, this is a place which feels like it could use a strange festival. I'd read Linda Godfrey's book when I first got here, Weird Wisconsin, and I was like, my goodness, is this state just filled with the most, like, there's UFO landing ports, there's this supposed Haunchyville where ex-retired circus midgets live and they'll kill you if you visit there, and Ed Gein lives up the road from where I used to be, and it was just story after story. Of course, the Hodag, the Beast of Bray Road, and I thought, I could do a festival here that isn't just a horror festival, which I obviously love and I've been doing in Sydney for over a decade, but I could do something which was a broader tent of all things weird and all things dark. And that's kind of how Midwest Weird Fest was born. It was because I was living in the weird environs of the North Woods, really.
I guess I should ask if somebody wants to give you a submission for a film, what do they do?
Sure, we've opened submissions again for 2025 now. So they can just go to midwestweirdfest.com and enter their film there. And we take horror films there as well. But if they have something they specifically want to enter into a horror festival, they can go to a nightofhorror.com. Both of those festivals are currently open for submissions. And when you go there, you'll be able to click through to that site I talked about before, Film Freeway, directly to either festival's submission page, and then all of the details are there. And they can submit literally online. They don't have to. In the olden days, when I first started doing this, you would get DVD screeners and VHSs and things sent to you in the mail, but now it's literally just a screener link on Vimeo or on YouTube or through
Right.
with that Film Freeway's own platform they have. And so it's all done you can probably do it. You can probably enter a film festival in a matter of minutes online these days.
Wow. The only thing about that is I'm the guy that I know you can stream everything these days, but I want the disc in my hand. I want to be able to walk over to the DVD player, put the disc in, and not only watch the movie, but watch all the extras. Man, I'm a real sucker for extras.
I think physical media makes more and more sense all the time when we see various streaming services dropping content, and you never know what you were able to watch yesterday is available tomorrow. And then
Right.
there's modern edits of things, and you don't know if anything, a film which once might have been totally acceptable becomes politically untouchable today. So you're not going to be able to get it on a screening platform anyway. So yeah, I think physical media is still king, and I think people are starting to realize there was a big movement away from physical media, I think. But I think people are starting to go, hey, I can't find this movie I once had on VHS on any streaming platform anymore. I really want to see it. So I think we're going to see exactly what you're talking about, people turning back to physical media.
I really hope so. Susie, I've been hogging the conversation. Is there anything you wanted to, any direction you wanted to go at this moment?
So I promise this is going to be my last Pukwudgie reference, but I did have to point
No,
out, since we
no,
brought up
we
weird
we
stuff
want at
in
least three.
Wisconsin.
Oh yes, go ahead.
There are Pukwudgies in Wisconsin. They
Ah,
are the bowl cut variety, though. They're not the mean ones that we have here. I
but yeah,
actually have newspaper clippings from Stratford, Wisconsin.
You
Uh,
know what? I'm giving away a part of my location. I regularly drive through Stratford, get out of town regularly.
yep. So they were spotted. There was a glowing green light that they saw first, and then they saw the eyes of these little people, and they said they were about 2.5 feet tall. They had hair on their faces, and they were wearing blue clothing and shiny belt buckles, and they were very fast, it said.
Wow.
something to look out for, Dean.
I know I'll have to tell my daughter as well. I've raised her with a solid sense of fairy faith. So any indication that there might be little creatures living near us, I'm sure she'll be delighted to hear.
And also
Excellent.
tell Dean and the audience what the difference is between the blue clad pugwudgies and the ones closer to your neck of the woods.
So out here, the Pukwudgies have huge pot bellies and quills on
Oh,
their head and their back. The Midwest Pukwudgies are a little bit softer, more conservative. They have blonde hair that they wear in bowl cuts, and their ears, they have the pointy ears that stick out of the bowl cuts, and they are generally sighted wearing blue clothing, which is usually described as a smock.
wow.
So very stylish.
I'll be keeping my eye out for the Pukwudgies now, as Steve suggested.
Well, listen, when you do find them, we'll have you back on.
That would be fantastic. I mean, we had a Bigfoot. In fact, in one of Linda's books, there's a Bigfoot sighting literally just up my road, like so close to here. And when I was reading it, I was like, I was listening to the description between the two towns that it said, and I said, I'm directly between those two towns. And then I looked at the road, and I'm like, that road's just like literally. I drive up my road, I don't know, like 100 feet and turn left, and I'm on that road. So I went to where that sign was. So yeah, this neck of the woods. Oh, and also there was in another one of Linda's books, there was one of the early dogman werewolf sightings in Wisconsin going back to the 1950s. It was literally in my town. Supposedly a farmer, and I'm outside of town, but the town closest to me, a farmer drove furiously into town one day and jumped out of his truck and was in hysterics about a wolf the size of a horse terrorizing his property. So
Oh,
there could very well be Pukwudgies here. There's Bigfoot, there's Sasquatch, there's, so, and Stratford's not too far away. So there may well be Pukwudgies even in my woods.
I if I ever see one, I want to see one with a bowl cut. I want to know who's their hairdresser.
Well, speaking of the wee folk and things living underground, like of course one of the reasons supposedly Richard Shaver, that I'm sure we're going to get into, decided to
Yes.
move to Amherst, which is also near me, according to Gray Barker at least, and they knew too much about flying saucers, was that there was meant to be a colony of Tero, who were the friendly underground humanoid dwellers in the Shaver mythology, living near Amherst, and Amherst isn't far from me either. So Who
I'll be
there's
darned.
there's Tero as well that near me. So yeah, I'm sure the Pukwudgies are part of that gang.
And for those that don't know, Gray Barker, he's in the state, grew up in the state that I'm living in, West Virginia, Clarksburg. He had Saucerian Publications. His book, his first book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, was about the infamous Men in Black who supposedly harassed and silenced UFO witnesses. And that maybe that's something we can get into later. But he actually, I remember John Keel talking about it. Of course, John Keel, Mothman Prophecies. John Keel said that Gray Barker started writing that book, and he got about halfway through, threw his hands up in the air, and just started making it up. So,
Well, it's funny because Barker obviously is somebody who, like Mosley, was a prankster. I knew Jim
yeah,
Mosley. I never met Barker. Barker passed before I was looking at any of this stuff at a serious level. But those people, while they were pranksters, I think there's still a level of sophistication. And obviously their writing's fantastic. But for example, I mentioned Barker talking about Shaver saying he moved to Amherst because there was a colony of good Taro nearby. Whether that's
yeah.
true or not, I have no idea. But the breakdown on the Shaver mystery in the beginning of They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers is probably one of the greatest breakdowns of the Shaver mystery I've ever seen. Like Barker does a thorough job as a journalist of covering the Shaver mystery with, I don't know, half a dozen pages in that book. So while, yes, I do think there's no doubt a prankstery element to people like Barker, and maybe even Keel, by the way, but that's another story. Still they're writing, all of those men's writing, Keel, Mosley, Barker, it still surpasses almost anything being written today.
I was just reading one of his columns from Chasing the Flying Saucers that Barker did, and his writing was captivating. He was talking about the first time he met James Mosley and went to his apartment and so forth, and then they were on Long John Nebel's radio show, and of course, Long John Nebel was the predecessor to Art Bell. But yeah, good stuff. And I also met Gray Barker briefly. Never
Oh,
met James
wow.
Mosley. It was I'll give you my Gray Barker story. It was 1976, and of course, Susie, you remember the 70s, right? Yeah, of
Oh
course.
yeah,
Yeah,
of
okay.
course.
It was 1976. It was the MUFON Symposium in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It was 10 years after the swamp gas fiasco, and Dr. Hynek was there speaking. The name of his talk was Swamp Gas Plus 10 and Counting. And a very serious talk, but with a lot of humor in it, talking about some of the mistakes he made in the old days. And of course, they never would have let Gray Barker actually speak there. But he came up with an armful of his Saucerian publications, and I saw him in the lobby. He was between where the speakers would stand and that had like book tables. And I forget what he dropped. He was telling a joke. He dropped an F bomb, and everybody just cracked up. I don't know if I actually heard it or missed it, but he was this really tall guy. All the pictures I had seen of him, he had like the close cropped hair, but he had kind of longish hair. He looked like somebody you'd see in the 50s in a coffee shop, like a beatnik, reading some kind of horrible poetry about something. But he had
Wow.
these super thick glasses. He had astigmatism in one eye, this baggy suit, and I kind of I had him off because a friend of mine, Kevin, he had gone to the 19. You guys just have to indulge me with this for a few minutes. He had gone to the 1967 Congress of Scientific Ufologists at the Commodore Hotel in New
Wow.
York City. And I was supposed to go. That we were in junior high, and his mom was offered to take me. My parents decided I wasn't going to go to New York City, so that
Oh,
was that.
no.
I had to live vicariously through Kevin, but Kevin met all these guys. He met Barker, he met Mosley, and all this stuff. So one of the first questions I asked Barker was, "Do you remember Kevin?" He said, "Oh yeah, and actually Kevin used to." We had an amateur publication. Kevin used to swipe one of his pictures every once in a while and put it on the cover. And then afterwards, he'd call up Gray and say, "Hey, Gray, I used your picture from such and such." And Gray'd say, "Oh, okay. Did you give credit to Saucerian Publications?" And he'd say, "Yeah. Okay. Have a nice day." Things were
Huh.
so easy in those days.
Yeah,
So
happy times.
and then I asked him about, there were some people said that his book, The Silver Bridge, they said that he ripped off Keel or whatever. Now I had never read The Silver Bridge, and of course he didn't. If you read it, But I asked him. I said, people have claimed that Keel, ripped off your book, and he says, I wish I could imitate him, but he said something like, "Oh no, I'm sure John wrote his own book." and and I asked him about a Man in Black kind of an attack in New Zealand. Ever read the UFO Warning by John Stewart?
No, I haven't read it.
Okay, that's just a really one of these bizarre Bender-like cases. Anyway, I won't belabor this, but yeah, that was my. I kind of did a brief interview in the lobby there with Gray Barker, and then the
Gosh.
postscript to that is I've been to the Barker archive a couple times, and I opened up one of the drawers, and there were the 6 issues of our magazine, the UFO Phenomenon, right in the Gray Barker archive. So
Oh my
I can
goodness.
I can
Wow.
I can just quit now and go home, I think. So
You really can. Of course, The Silver Bridge is a fantastic book. It's very
yes.
different to Mothman Prophecies, but while it was published under the Sorcerian Press imprint, you know who printed that book, right?
I know who did the reprint, but I'm not the
No,
original.
the
Oh,
original.
was it Palmer?
Yeah, I have a copy
Oh,
of it here for that very reason.
okay, very good.
Yeah, so it literally got printed down the road from again where I am. So it's another weird part of this part of the state. So apparently Palmer printed, and I only know a lot of this because Gabriel McKee is coming out with what I imagine is going to be just a spectacular autobiography about Barker.
Oh,
And I
great.
interviewed him for The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers, just like I interviewed you, Steve. And then we've kept in touch and we've talked about these things. And I was like, can you give me a list of every Barker book that Palmer published when he was in Amherst? And he sent me it was like, these ones are for sure, and Silverbridge was on that. These are almost definite, and these are probable, because obviously Palmer wasn't dropping his own imprint on these because they were Caesarean press, or Caesarean, however you pronounce it, press. But he published an awful lot of Barker stuff. And of course, Barker was, I think, what was his title in Flying Saucer magazine, which Palmer published? It was like assistant editor, or so he had some title in all of those early Raymond Palmer Flying Saucer magazines as well.
No, I didn't realize that he had was publishing the Saucerian books.
Yeah, because I think, well, he had he had a printing press there. So while he was printing out his own stuff, which was fairly extensive, of course, The Coming of the Saucer and Flying Saucer Pilgrimage, and mind you, I think the Shaver book he published was before he had the printing press in. When he republished, I remember Lemuria and the Return of Satanas, when he actually did a book version of that. That was just before he was in Amherst. But as you know, I'm sure in your library, Steve, because you've got an extensive library, I bet you we could pull out 10 or 20 Palmer published publications. I'm not even counting the magazines, which I'm sure you have as well. I just mean the physical books. So he was really the #1 publisher and printer of probably flying saucer material in the US for a long time. Again, one of the sad stories that Palmer's been almost forgotten. I mean, not by you and I, but I'm in the broader UFO community.
Well, and actually, some of Barker's publications blur a little bit with Timothy Green Beckley, because he kind of, the mantle was sort of passed to him. And when I think back to some of those books, I can't remember, was it Global Communications, or was it New Saucerian? Because
Right.
it's kind of seamless. But I want to mention that Susy has also been kind of infected by John Keel. She has recently read. Maybe I should let you say what you have recently read by John Keel.
I've read the Mothman Prophecies. I started with that. You have to, and then I just finished The Eighth Tower.
Oh, fantastic!
And I was very upset with Steve when I read the Mothman Prophecies, because there is mention of little people in that. And no one ever told me, or I would have read it years ago.
Well, I think what might have enticed her was that she has done a lot of research into the Thunderbird phenomena, the large bird phenomena, in connection with the Bridgewater Triangle. And of course, John Keel has that great chapter in there, The Flutter of Black Wings, where he covers all kinds of bizarre winged creatures.
The Garudas, Keel would often call them, right?
Yes. Right.
Yep.
No, I think Keel.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go, Steve. I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead. I was just I was just trying to fill in the pause there. But please go ahead.
I think Keel, I'm not sure if he still is. I know for me, because it was before the Mothman Prophecies film, obviously, and you were even were into Keel earlier, but Keel seemed to be the gateway book for many people to start to look at the UFO phenomenon more broadly than just the nuts and bolts interpretation that was obviously the popular one, which we'd all been raised on with science fiction movies and In Search Of and everything else. It was Keel that seemed to let us be able to go, oh, there's weird big birds. There's also strange little men. There's also flying saucers. There's also all of this other nonsensical stuff. It was very much like Charles Fort had returned, conscious of everything that had happened in the last 50 years and rewritten and restructured his ideas of how weird the world was with modern stories, because the Fortean spirit, the spirit which is suspicious of orthodoxies, I don't think really is held by people who are traditional ufologists or people who are traditional cryptozoologists or people who are traditional ghost hunters. I think all of those people still look to a scientific method to somehow solve this problem, and we can bang on the doors of the scientific institutions long enough with enough proof, and eventually they're going to open the doors and we'll be accepted. Of course, Charles Fort said that's nonsense. That's never going to happen. It's not the way science works. And throughout John Keel's writings, you have this similar sense, an updated sense, but a similar sense that so much of this is just not going to be able to be worked out by any type of scientific or positivistic or empirical model. It's all far too strange. And that's the real value, I think, of both Fort and Keel. The fact that everything people like you, Steve, and I, and Susie are interested in is far more complicated than what a lot of mainstream ufology, mainstream cryptozoology, mainstream specter chasers are ever going to, put forward as the reality of the weird.
And Susie, when you're reading Keel, I don't think you found his writings like a terrible shock.
Well, it was a shock in the aspect that I said people have already come to the same conclusions I have independently. There are other people that think the same way, which was a little bit of emotional roller coaster for a while. So it wasn't his theories were not shocking to me. It was more of a shock that other people think the same way.
Okay. For me, when I read Strange Creatures from Time and Space before it became The Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings, in the old days, it had that great Frank Frazetta painting on the
so
cover.
Wonderful. It's such a beautiful artwork, the cover of that original paperback. It's amazing.
And they never made a poster out of that. I always wanted that. I've got the big Mothman one that came out, was on the High Times magazine cover. But
you know what? I'll tell you just quickly, Steve, to cut in there. You
Yeah.
can get a poster of it from the Frank Frazetta store, I think, but there's no man in the middle. The man in the kind of, I don't know, the safari suit or something,
Yeah.
looking at the monsters, which I guess I always took to be John Keel himself, right?
Yeah.
You can get the artwork, but for some reason, I don't know what happened, but the artwork you can buy, the poster you can buy, does not have the man in the safari suit looking at the monsters.
I think he was supposed to be a like a constable, like a policeman, but with the wide brimmed hat. That was my impression.
Gotcha.
But
I always thought it was just meant to be Keel out in the wilds exploring.
Okay. Well,
I don't
could
know.
be.
I have no idea.
But it's so cool because he's got his hand up, and they've got this array of creatures coming at him, like his hand up is going to stop them somehow. But anyway, that's where Keel kind of just nudges us a little bit and starts talking about window areas, trying to come to grips with how is it that these things seem to all of a sudden show up and they disappear, but we can't catalog them, we can't catch them, and so forth. But I have to say, Susie, when I first read Operation Trojan Horse, I didn't read it for a few years after it came out, and I was still a nuts and bolts guy. I just didn't want. I mean, I could handle extra dimensional passageways, I guess, but pulling all that together. And I confess this on a past show, Dean. When I used to get my Fate magazines back in the 60s, I had no use for anything but the UFO article. I cut out the UFO article and threw the rest of the magazine away.
Huh. Well, that's kind of indicative of what most people are like, though, right? Like most people traditionally have either been interested in they've been interested in one specific aspect of the Fortean realm, and that's why so much was lost as far as the type of comparative analysis, which people like Keel and Verley, and then later Patrick Harper, and now people like Joshua
Oh,
Kuchin
yes.
do so well. But we lost it. And just as a quick aside, it's funnily enough, I just bought the first 70 issues of Fate magazine the other day, except issue 1, it wasn't included in the lot because
Oh,
issue 1's worth so much money, right? You
yeah.
can actually, from Fate magazine themselves, they do a reproduction of issue 1. I think you can buy from like $24. I have a PDF I downloaded, but I will buy that from Fate one day, or I'll pay the $1,000 if I ever have the money for Fate 1. But I bought the first 70 issues. And what's fascinating about this, I'll ask you this question, see if you guys can get it. When we think about the world of the weird now, the broader Fortean world, which is often, I think, used incorrectly, that term, but we'll use Fortean. Today we think about all these different things, right? Obviously, and I won't say what they are, it will spoil my question, but the covers of Fate had all kinds of different things on them in that first run. This is a run that goes through Palmer. But what wasn't on any of those first covers, do you think, you guys? Which now you couldn't imagine not being on like 10 years worth of issues of a broad magazine that was looking at all things weird.
You got me.
Any ideas, Susie?
No.
Well, there's UFOs, there's things like voodoo, there's things like Easter Island, as you would imagine. There's things like the Loch Ness Monster. There's more UFOs. There's more ghostly things. There's more haunting things. There's no Bigfoot on one cover.
Oh, right.
And so it's funny how essential Bigfoot is to this whole realm now, right? But because, of course, this is before the Jerry Crew photos, or certainly before of Jerry Crew footprints, and certainly before the Patterson Gimlin footage.
Right.
Bigfoot wasn't a thing. And I think this is the most valuable thing. My time may be wasted in academia, I don't know. But the most valuable thing I learned as an historian looking at the weird is that the way we imagine the timeline of our beliefs or everything else is actually inaccurate to what the perceptions were of the paranormal and the strange. It's like today when you tell people nobody was talking about Dogman 10, 15 years ago, right? And they go,
Right.
well, there was this report out of Texas and I'm like, yeah, I know that, I understand, but it wasn't on. You can watch the whole run of In Search Of, and there's no Dogman episode. Can you imagine a monstery show today or a broad Fortean show today that didn't talk about Dogman? So our beliefs and our perceptions, and they change so much dependent upon the culture. And you can see that in microcosms as well. You can see that in UFO lore. You can see that within the things we believe about what UFO occupants are like, what the intentions of the UFO nauts are. We're so bound historically and culturally, we can get lost in a moment and we can reassess history through our own lens, and we can kind of telescope it, and we can miss the fact that, for example, like I just said, Bigfoot wasn't even looked at in the first, at least on the covers of the first 10 years worth of Fate magazine. And I think that's quite telling. I think we're historical beings, and the things we're interested in are also trapped within this cultural historical lens. And things, like Fort said, they appear at the time that we're kind of ready for them to appear. Or certainly that seems to be the way it seems when you look at this stuff historically.
I sent it's funny, you talked about being in an area where this paranormal stuff had happened and you drove down that very road. I sent a message to Susie that I was reading a copy of an old 1956 UFO Forum newsletter. And it's talking about a Bigfoot-like creature, without using the word Bigfoot,
Ah,
in Marshall, Michigan, where I used to live. And these three men saw this thing. They called it a monster. They said it had hands instead of paws. It had a really bad smell. And
wow.
when Gray Barker reported on it, he said it would glide along like the Flatwoods monster did. And
Wow.
so it prompted me to check out, when did the Bigfoot name come into the nomenclature? And it was about 1958, I think. So this was
Right.
just a couple of years prior to that. So that's really interesting. But now, was this anything to do with the dissertation that you wrote when you talked about the UFO phenomenon and the perception of it in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think that was one of my main, and I used various, I guess, methodologies to look at it. So I used historical and sociological and psychological and even postmodern, as much as I'm not a postmodernist. There was some postmodern theory which kind of made sense. But I think my main takeaway was what I kind of just said. So to apply that to ufology, if you talk to a ufologist today to tell you what the history of UFOs are in America since post-World War II, right? They'll all start with either the Kenneth Arnold sighting, or they will start, of course, with the Roswell event. And then the Roswell event transforms into the smoking gun of ufology, where the US government become aware of this. And then there's all these secret deals with the aliens. And then there's all of this,
Yes.
like that's the story now, right? You can't talk about UFO belief without talking about Roswell. And indeed, when they had the recent whistleblower hearings last year in US Congress here, you had US congressman, it might even have been a congresswoman, say the American public have been fascinated with the UFOs ever since something crashed at Roswell. Of course, as you and I know, Steve, maybe Susie does, I'm not sure how much into UFOs she actually is, but as somebody who's perhaps done a deeper dive into the UFO topic, is that nobody talked about Roswell in the US after the initial newspaper report went out and that went through around the wire services of the world. As soon as the US government, the Army Air Force at the time, said it was just a weather balloon, that was the end of the Roswell story.
Yep.
Nobody talked about Roswell until the late 70s, early 1980s. In fact, I've got multiple UFO encyclopedias in my library here, as I'm sure you do as well, Steve, because your library is amazing. I've seen photos of it. But I've got one from Ronald's Story, I think, and one from Margaret Sachs. I think they were both published in 1980. Neither of those reference, certainly not the Story one. I think the Sachs one's the same. None of them even mention Roswell. It's not even a word in there, let alone an entry. So it goes to show that up until 1980, this wasn't something anybody who was a UFO believer even thought about in America. Now, that's inconceivable today when you ask somebody to tell the historical narrative. And what happened? Well, they say, and I've heard people have been angry with me. They're like, well, that's before Stanton Friedman and William Moore went out there and did all of that research. And I'm like, that's by the by. The point is that nobody talked about Roswell the way they do today. And of course, William Moore ends up being an AFOSI asset under Richard Doty anyway. And I think so much of what we believe today about what your average UFO believer believes today is I call X-Files ufology today, because that's a very simple explanation. In other words, what I was saying, UFO crashes, secret government, deals, underground bases, reversed engineered UFOs, all of this type of stuff. None of this stuff becomes influential at all in the thinking of most ufologists until that period where William Moore writes the first book with Charles Berlitz, in which Stanton Friedman does some of the research on. And I can't say who, or I won't, because I'm not sure, but they did say it in a show of mine. Somebody who's very high in the paranormal community told me that they were talking to Stanton Friedman, and they called him once, and it was definitely in a government office. Let's just put it that way. So their implication was maybe Friedman was on the payroll, just like William Moore was. So who'd be surprised, right? Who'd be surprised, really? But everything we think about the X-Files version of UFO belief, it all comes out of this cadre of very small individuals. William Moore and Jamie Shandera get the MJ-12 papers. William Moore is already an asset of Richard Doty. Before that, supposedly before he was an asset, who the devil knows, he wrote he was the Berlitz's name was really on the cover, but the main person who did most of the legwork was William Moore, along with some stuff from Stanton Friedman. The Dulce underground base stuff, the cattle mutilation stuff, all of this comes from literally 4 or 5 people. I literally just named them. And that stuff's so essential to what people believe about UFOs now. Before that, it didn't exist.
And some of these names you've mentioned, probably some people are just kind of blurring. They don't know what we're
Sure.
talking about, but they're kind of, I've like Richard Doty and so forth. I think of disinformation guys.
Well, I had Richard Doty on Talking Weird some time ago. Personally, I really like Richard Doty. I got on very well with him. But Richard Doty, so if we were going to talk about the Paul Benowitz affair, and I can just say it very briefly and then we'll move on. But Paul Benowitz was an electrical engineer, private businessman who lived opposite Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico. And he started seeing strange lights and he thought he was picking up weird messages from the base. So as a good patriot, he went to the base and said, I think there's UFOs and weird stuff happening around here. Now, the base apparently, according to Greg Bishop, and I think also, what's the other great book? The Kook, Spooks and Saucers book. Anyway,
Yeah.
Adam Go-Rightly's book. So Greg Bishop's book, Project Beta, which is phenomenal. Go-Rightly's book is amazing as well. But as they say in that book, and let's stick with Bishop's, that there was actually a high-end Air Force laser communication thing happening in that base. And I think Doty said similar things too, even though Doty says there really are UFOs and aliens and everything else. But instead of just swearing Paul Benowitz to secrecy, the AFOSI operation within that base, headed by Paul Benowitz, well, not headed by Paul Benowitz, he was the victim, headed by Richard Doty, decided, well, we're going to just spin the information and make him think there really are aliens that he's hearing and UFOs that he's seeing. And so they just fed into Paul Benowitz's belief that there was this alien presence around the base. Supposedly Richard Doty, the head AFOSI agent on the case, even flew Benowitz, and I think Doty talks about this himself, flew Benowitz over the Dulce Mesa and said, look, there's a crash saucer there, or there's an entrance there, fueling all of this belief about underground bases in the area. Now, in Adam Go-Rightly's book, and this is a difficult thing to say, but it's in Go-Rightly's book, which I just mentioned, Go-Rightly says that the computer that everybody's heard about that was given to Paul Benowitz to supposedly decode the alien messages, and all it was this US intelligence-built computer which fed him all these crazy alien messages. Supposedly, according to Go-Rightly, it was Hynek himself was part of that sting and gave Benowitz that computer system himself. So if that's the case, ufology is so dirty, even without the Hynek story, ufology is so dirty. William Moore, arguably the most significant UFO journalist, writer in the field in the late 70s through the early 80s. Again, he's the person who wrote the initial Roswell book. He's the person who broke the MJ-12 document scandal. He's the person who later, at a MUFON symposium in 1989, stands up on tape and says, I have to confess, under Richard Doty, I'm an asset for the AFOSI. We've been spying on you all. We've been gathering data, and we've been feeding you nonsense. Now, the funny thing is, ufology didn't go, well, hang on. The Roswell story, the Dulce story, the cattle mutilation story, the MJ-12 documents, all of that, it comes from William Moore, and he just said it's all nonsense. Instead, all they did was hate William Moore and Richard Doty and double down on their belief system, because this is years before the X-Files. This is years before the paranoia hit the height in the 1990s. This is 89. So ufology didn't learn its lesson, even when William Moore stands in front of them and admits the fact that he was playing them. And we're still suffering from that delusion.
That's bizarre. And even the crash saucer with the little men, the one that people confuse with Roswell sometimes, is the one that it was actually Aztec, the Behind Flying Saucers by Scully. And that apparently was a hoax. A couple of con men created that. So there's so much of this that just kind of falls away. Let me do a brief station identification here.
Sure.
You are listening to the High Strangeness Factor, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Susy Bastille and I are talking to Dean Bertram about his various projects and all things paranormal. I love the way this conversation is just going everywhere. Susy, any questions, any interjections at the moment?
No, but I think it's a great point that, one or two people with an agenda or a bias can really almost shape the history of a phenomenon. And everyone kind of looks at life through a certain lens. And you can even have, two people experiencing the same event that take something different away from it. Like one person might see two people might see the same entity. One person thinks it's an alien. The other person thinks it's an angel, depending on the way you're looking at it. And, you know, whoever the louder person is, that's what the common belief is going to be at the time.
Absolutely.
I'd like to move into the shaver mystery a little bit, but I am curious about what was your pathway to get here? Were you interested in these sort of subjects when you were in Australia, and did you carry it with you over to the States, or what when did you discover John Keel? What was kind of your pathway to get where you are?
Oh my gosh, it's such a long story. I'll give you a very abbreviated one. What would be another hour conversation.
Okay, that's fine.
So when I was young, I had, I think, some type of, I don't know, how a dream, a recurring dream, or some type of night terrors, although they were different to other night terrors, where I thought a little man was coming to my room and taking me away. And I have very clear memories about this as well. Anyway, long story short, without going into those details, many years later, in the 1990s, I discovered a book by Edith Fiore, her book Encounters. So it's not the normal alien abduction gateway book, which would have back then been Whitley Strieber's Communion, or one of the books by Bud Hopkins like Missing Time or Intruders. But when I read that book, and she's very clever. And this is a woman who fully believes in the UFO experience. She'd read Donald Kehoe's first book back in the 50s, and she said from that moment on, in the introduction to the book, that I was a full believer in extraterrestrial visitation. So maybe that should have cued me in, but I was in my 20s and perhaps not quite as sophisticated. But when I read her book, I was like, maybe I'm an alien abductee. I have these memories of, this little man taking me away and da 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 da. So then I went down the rabbit hole of UFO research. I read everything I could get my hands on. And for a long time, like you, Steve, I was a full nuts and bolts believer in extraterrestrial visitation, little man in, metallic crafts from outer space. And then I happened to be doing a trip to America, and I ended up living in a residential area with some people I met on a long trip that I spent here long before I lived here. And long story short, one of their roommates ended up moved out through, I won't go into the gory details, but they were hospitalized, and then they had to clear out his effects. And this is back in, I guess, 90, I don't know, 91, 92, 93. I can't even remember the year, but in his books was a copy of the Mothman Prophecies. And I was like, can I read this book? And one of the guys was there like, yeah, I've read it. It's a great book. And that book changed my life because I was already interested in the UFO phenomenon. I was already essentially a believer. And then I read Keel's book, and I was like, you can look at this phenomenon without being a skeptic and dismissing it and acknowledging people's experiences, but without having to accept the cultural normative explanations of what's going on. And I was obsessed. And so I went back to Australia shortly thereafter, and I was just, bumming around as we do in our 20s sometimes. I was like, I'm going to go back to university, and I'm going to do a master's degree in history, and I'm going to write my master's dissertation, which is much smaller than a PhD dissertation, on UFOs. And then I did that. And when I was doing my master's, I was like, well, I'm just going to be a rabble rouser with a master's. I might as well do a PhD. So then I pitched to do a PhD and do a more extensive examination of the UFO phenomenon. So yeah, I was well interested in all of this long before I moved here to the US. That's probably a longer answer than you wanted, but that's what happened.
No, that's great. And did you get any resistance when you
Oh, I got it.
proposed?
Yeah. Yes. Oh my goodness. That's a great question. I think now people writing in academia have it much better than people probably did, 30, 40 years ago. Now go to when I was doing this in the late 90s to the mid 2000s, or the mid 90s actually to the mid 2000s. After I'd done my MA, the woman who ran the master's program at Sydney University really was resistant to somebody within a very reputable, respectable department looking at this type of material. So when you to get into the PhD program, you either need to have gone through the BA honors route. And I was over university by the time I'd done 3 years in my BA. I foolishly didn't do my honors. So, but when you go back and do your masters, it's kind of the same thing. So she knew I wanted to do my PhD, and she knew what I wanted to do my PhD in because I was doing it in my masters. And so there was an essay that she that she marked my long essay, which was actually different to my dissertation. And that was such a major part of the mark as well. And she gave me literally 1 mark less than I needed, I think, to be able to move into the PhD program. And I knew why. She was always resistant. She was always hostile. Thankfully, my supervisor at the time was a heavy hitter within the department. And thankfully, the head of the department was a heck of a nice guy. And I went to him and complained, and I said, listen, I think we understand the resistance I'm having here, and I think the quality of this essay is pretty high, and I think I've intentionally been undermarked to prevent me from doing this at a PhD level. And God bless the head of the department, he agreed, and he read the essay and he reassessed the mark, and the mark increased considerably, and then I was able to move into the PhD program. But if it hadn't been for people who were more forward thinking in that department, if it had been the older guard, because both of those men I mentioned were younger than the older guard who was the head of the MA program, I wouldn't have got into a PhD program. I would have been stopped right there.
That's a great story.
Yeah, absolutely true too. I still remember clearly sitting in the head of the department's office and just being mad, but also kind of somewhat intimidated. It's the head of the department, you know what I mean? So you're trying to pitch your case, but no, he was very understanding. I won't name anybody's names, but that's exactly what happened.
Well, very good. Okay.
So I have to
go ahead.
ask.
Yes.
So, do you remember how old you were when you were having those nightmares by any chance?
Yeah, it's funny because I often say I believe I was around 5 years old, so it's difficult to pin it down precisely, but I would say 5.
Yeah, the reason I asked is because I listen to a lot of experiencer interviews, and I'm gonna out myself as a nerd, but I keep a spreadsheet of common denominators to try to find patterns. And I've noticed a trend of 8-year-olds specifically having those types of dreams.
I think I was a little younger. I think I continued to have weird experiences going forward, but I'm more confident that they were genuine night terrors. While my younger experience was, it wasn't like normal sleep paralysis, because I had sleep paralysis later. I very clearly remember sleep paralysis, but my younger experiences were far stranger and far more tactile. Like I have very real physical memories of some of those things, which of course I always want to dismiss it as just some kind of psychological issue I was working through or a dream state. But the physical things make me think of like the Islamicist Henry Corbin, who's an academic who dealt with Islamic mysticism, and he would talk about this kind of state between the real and the other, this imaginal realm where things seem sometimes to be heightened and seem to be as real, if not more real, than your day-to-day life. And some of my memories, and I'm also very conscious that memories are clouded by time, but some of my memories of my experiences with the little man, which is how I've always referred him to, particularly one or two, that they're as physically real, if not realer to me than other experiences that I had at that time, like wrestling boys in playgrounds as little kids do, fighting other kids. My last memory of the little man, by the way, just as an aside, was I knew if I went with him that night, I was never coming back. And when he came, I physically resisted and I fought him, not necessarily like, Rocky Balboa boxing or anything, but like wrestling and struggling on the top of the bed. And then I don't know if I can say I beat him, but there was obviously some kind of impasse, and he left and he never returned. But that physical memory is a very, very, very strong memory still.
Have you read any of Paul Sinclair's books?
No, I haven't, but I'm guessing I should.
He in Yorkshire, he was on my show. Fascinating guy. You would love to have him on Talking Weird. North and East Yorkshire, he's a guy that boots on the ground. He has documented orbs, dogman-like creatures, black panthers, triangles. But he had a whole series of experiences like that. His books are called Truth, Proof, The Truth That Leaves No Proof. He's written 4 of them, but after he got past 3, he took a deviation, and he wrote, oh, come on, what's it called? I can't think of the name right now, but it talks about his childhood into young adulthood and all the bizarre experiences that he had. Oh, it's called Night People, I think. That's what he
Oh
called
wow.
them. And you know, because of the experiences you've had, I think you'll find this fascinating. You can get them on Kindle. Anybody that's listening, you don't want to get these from Amazon either in the U.S. or the U.K. because third-party sellers have them and they've jacked the prices up. I ordered mine, some of them directly from Paul in the UK. And just as an aside, he also has a phenomenal documentary called Wolflands on the essentially he calls them the werewolf, but the essentially the dogman sightings in Yorkshire in
Wow.
England. So it's just fascinating stuff. So pardon me. I think I'd like to move into the shaver mystery a little bit now.
I'd love to too.
Okay. Now Susie is going to have to be vigilant and keep us honest because it would be very easy for you and I, Dean, just to talk over everybody's head when we get into Shaver. So I want Susie to crack the whip if all of a sudden we kind of go off the rails.
Sounds good.
So how did you get involved in the Shaver mystery? What was your pathway there?
Well, it goes back to when I was doing my PhD dissertation, and obviously I was doing a deep dive historical, I suppose, examination of things that led up to UFO belief. And it was actually, again, John Keel. It was John Keel's article in Fortean Times, The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers, which is I've totally stolen that title for the feature. And I guess the literary heir of John Keel is probably Doug Skinner. And I told Doug, I'm like, I'm sorry, I've stolen John's title. And he didn't seem to mind. So I don't feel too bad about stealing it. But that article that John Keel wrote in the Fortean Times, I have the issue over there, is a winter 1981 or winter 1982 issue, sometime early in the 80s. Similarly, he'd said similar things in his famous article on the UFO subculture, which he used to sell he used to sell a booklet version at conferences here. I have a copy of that too, with Doug Skinner's amazing art on the cover. But Keel's point, anyway, I could go see. I'm already going. You should be cracking the whip, Susie, because I can totally go off track.
Well,
when I
well,
start
one
talking.
thing very quickly, Doug Skinner, for those who don't know, has johnkeel.com, and he has collected all kinds of stuff. In fact, two of my friends, John and Tim Frick, they were alerted by some of Keel's family members when he died, and they were going to clean out his apartment. And they couldn't get there to remove some of the stuff. So they were instrumental in getting a hold of Doug Skinner because of that chain of events. A lot of the stuff has been preserved. But imagine the stuff that has been lost. But thank God so much of it hasn't been.
The
Exactly.
people
And
playing the Keel drinking game tonight are just passed out by now.
Dean, there's a friend of mine, Jeff Talkington. He said they do whenever I do my show, they do whenever I mention John Keel, they take a swig. And so usually they're out by about 5 to 7 minutes.
well, I don't think you can talk about anything in this space if you're wired like you and I are, Steve, without talking about
Right.
Keel. So it was that article, and it was also the UFO subculture piece that Keel wrote in the Journal of Popular Culture, and then sold that booklet for, where he, I think correctly, identified Ray Palmer, and in many ways his involvement with Richard Shaver, of laying the groundwork for much of the flying saucer mythology, which would erupt in the mid 1947. Because, as you and I know, Steve, and maybe the listeners don't, Richard Shaver wrote a letter to Amazing Stories in 1943, and Richard Shaver in that letter said that he discovered this ancient antediluvian alphabet, which all modern languages derive from. And Ray Palmer published that, even though his assistant editor, Harold Brown, threw it in the trash can, which is a wonderful story in itself. But after that, Palmer knew he was onto something. And so he continued correspondence with Richard Shaver. And Richard Shaver made these claims that he had been in contact, both physically and mentally, with underground civilizations, which dated back again to antediluvial times. And the evil people were known as the Darrow, and the good people below the surface, as I mentioned before, there's meant to be a colony of them near Amherst, just down the road from me, were called the Terror. And these people, the Darrow at least, kidnapped people, ate people, were responsible for everything from car crashes to people falling down flights of stairs. They were essentially, as Keel said, and I know you've said as well many times, Steve, it was like a modern devil theory.
Right.
But John Keel recognized that this suggestion of this alternative non-humanoid race with incredibly advanced technology, supposedly abducting people, flying out of the caverns in proto-flying saucers, had set the stage for 1947 when Kenneth Arnold saw flying saucers near Moria. Well, it wasn't near Moria. That's a later part of the story, near Mount Rainier. And even Amazing Stories, that again, the magazine that Ray Palmer was the editor of, it had artwork on the back covers of it particularly, but even sometimes on some of the front covers on some of the Shaver stuff that looked very much like flying saucers before people were talking about flying saucers. And just as I'm ranting about flying saucers, there's a great book by Chris Orbeck which talks about the origin of flying saucers, which is worth reading, which is a different story altogether. But if we stay with the Shaver mystery stuff, so Keel acknowledged and recognized how influential the Shaver mystery was in the development of flying saucer mythology a few years after, because that first Shaver letter, I think, is published in 43 or 44. And then Amazing Stories, which was America's major science fiction pulp magazine at the time, became, for the next 2 or 3 years, essentially the Shaver magazine. Most of the covers were Shaver art. Most of the leading stories were stories by Shaver. A lot of the other content that wasn't written by Shaver were similar stories that were backing up the Shaver mystery. Various Forteans like Vincent Gaddis and other science fiction authors like Rog Phillips were chiming in and building up the Shaver mystery. And so Amazing Stories was essentially no longer a science fiction magazine. It was talking about a genuine non-human but humanoid influence interacting with us with incredibly advanced technology, including strange flying craft. So Keel pointed out, obviously this is what birthed much of the belief about flying saucers. So anyway, that's what got me interested in it, because as an historian trying to understand, I know it's a long answer to your question, but as an historian trying to understand flying saucer culture from the 1940s onwards, or 1947 onwards, I knew I had to look back and look at some of the influences. And certainly the Shaver influence was a massive one.
And speaking of that, you mentioned Vincent Gaddis, who wrote these scientific pieces for Amazing Stories. Just before the Kenneth Arnold sighting, I think maybe a month or so, I'm not sure of the actual date, but just a year before that, he wrote a piece called Into the Void. And he talks about UFO sightings,
Absolutely.
Before the term flying saucer was coined.
Well, what's fascinating about that, you're absolutely right, Stephen. That was the June 1947 all Shaver issue of Amazing Stories.
Oh, that's right. I
June 1947, when Kenneth Arnold first sees the flying saucers flying in front of Mount Rainier. That issue has been the most recent issue of Amazing Stories. It was already on the newsstands. And you're right, Vincent Gaddis is writing this piece reminiscent of Charles Fort, talking about all these strange, ships in the sky, these weird, craft, before the term flying saucers existed. But you read it and it's a flying saucer article.
Right. And I have to tell Susie, there's so much to this, and we're just going to not even scratch the surface. But you can find online. There is this great interview on Long John Neville's show, WOR, and he called. This has been old days technology. He was talking to Richard Shaver and Ray Palmer in Wisconsin via beeper phone. So you're hearing this conversation going, and every once in a while you hear the beep. And so they're talking all about the Shaver mystery. And it's just one of the most fascinating conversations. I mean, Shaver's claiming things like there are certain skyscrapers in different cities. If you hit the basement button twice, it goes all the way down into the caverns where the Darrow are. I mean, it's just absolutely mind-numbing. But there are stuff, and one of the places you can go to find this stuff is called the Faded Discs Archive. They have a lot of that stuff there. But yes, and go on, Dean. What I mean, there's I must have I don't know, 3 dozen books related to Shaver, Palmer, the Hollow Earth, which is an offshoot of all that.
Mhm.
Uh, it's amazing. Now, you're doing a document. Tell us about. I guess maybe you should tell us about the documentary and how you got started doing that.
Well, just quickly, it's fascinating you mentioned that Long John Nebel show because
Yeah.
it's a bit of a spoiler, but my documentary starts with that radio interview.
Oh, excellent.
That's actually how the documentary starts. And I'll tell you another aside before I talk about how I got started, because I think you'll love this, Steve. Is when I visited Raymond B. Palmer, Ray Palmer's son, who still lives in Amherst, Wisconsin. When I visited him, he was like, "Yeah, I still have the original recording of that show that we did on our end of Richard Shaver and my dad." Because when you listen to the broadcast, it's very crackly and it's like
Right.
1950s technology, but he has a pristine audio recording of their end of that conversation,
Oh my
amongst
God.
hundreds of other things. I'll tell you one other story because I think your listeners will dig this. So I got to spend some time with Ray Palmer's son at Ray Palmer's original home in Wisconsin. Well, not his original home because he was from Milwaukee, but his original home in Amherst, where both he and Richard Shaver moved literally as neighbors. That goes to show how close of friends they were. And that's a story I look at in the documentary as well, because nobody really understands the timeline because nobody went and pulled out the deeds. And here's another spoiler for the documentary. Different people have said, well, Richard Shaver moved there first, and then Ray Palmer visited the area, and he really liked Amherst, Wisconsin as well. So he eventually moved there. But nobody had been to Portage County. Nobody had pulled the deeds. But I live like in the county next door to Portage County, so it wasn't hard for me to go and pull the deeds and the original maps. Richard Shaver and Raymond Palmer bought their properties in Amherst, Wisconsin a month apart. Now, as my old co-host on Mysterious Library, Jason McLean, who's an incredible human being and his books are amazing, but he also works in real estate escrow. He said in in the late 1940s, when they bought these properties, a month apart in the closing of the sale was simultaneous. It just meant what bank could do it first. In other words, Raymond Palmer and Richard Shaver were so close that they'd scouted properties in Wisconsin, which were neighboring properties on the other side of the road, by the way, not like immediately next to each other, but they're opposite each other. One's on one side, one's on the other side. They scouted that area, and nobody's ever talked about this before. They clearly scouted that area, and they clearly decided to move from Milwaukee together to Amherst, Wisconsin, in the middle of nowhere, and bought neighboring properties. Within a month of each other, those properties were closed. So they obviously looked for properties that close together, and they bought properties that close together. So that's one of the more fascinating things I found doing some of the research of the documentary. And I think you were saying what led me to the documentary, so I'll keep ranting and then I'll stop, is I was, again, with Jason McLean on an old show I used to do called Mysterious Library. I suggested, let's do I Remember Lemuria, because we used to do different books and different, articles and things. I said, let's do I Remember Lemuria. It'd be fun. It'd be cute. Let's look at Shaver Palmer. Now, I'd been interested in this when I wrote my dissertation in Sydney, Australia. I
And
wasn't in Wisconsin.
tell everybody what I remember Lemuria came from.
So I Remember Lemuria was the following Shaver this following Shaver story or letter or writing after that initial alphabet story I talked to you about before, which
A-
called Mantong, which sounds very much like Mantung, and was supposedly when Shaver had cracked what the original universal language was. So
And then he
Palmer
wrote the what was it, a 10,000 word manuscript?
Right, Warning to Future Man. So
Right.
Richard
Okay.
Shaver sent Ray Palmer a manuscript called Warning to Future Man, which apparently wasn't particularly narrative driven. It was more about the kind of Shaver mythology or the Shaver belief system about the Darrow and the Tarot, and about how they got underground, these beings, and while the ancient, Atlans and the Titans had fled to outer space because of the radiation of the sun, and the Darrow had, you know, I suppose, been so affected by the poison from the ancient mech machines that they had, that they turned into these hideous beings that wanted nothing more than to torment and kill the surface dwellers, while the Terro, who were more noble, hadn't been so mutated by the machines and wanted to help us and were nice guys. But when that was written to Palmer, Palmer saw the genius in it. And so he recrafted it into a story called I Remember Lemuria, and which we forget Ray Palmer's responsible for. All the Buck Rogers-y science fiction, Captain Kirk, people punching each other and tearing their shirts and making out with beautiful alien babes. That's from Ray Palmer. Before that, when other people ran that magazine, and there was the competing magazine Astounding, all the fans wanted in there, the hardcore fans, there were only probably about 1,000 of them in the country. They wanted like stories which looked at current technological developments and imagined what they would be like in 50 or 100 years. While Ray Palmer was like, to his writers, he would literally say, if the story's boring, throw another body through the skylight. Like he wanted action and excitement. And so I Remember Lemuria, which he essentially, ghost wrote for Richard Shaver, even though it was under Richard Shaver's byline, is that it's filled with beautiful alien babes and, people being, bashing each other and fighting and ray gun battles and the battle for the planet Earth. And it's very much what we're used to seeing in modern science fiction today. But so he transformed that initial story, and Ray Palmer wasn't comfortable saying that Richard Shaver had had these experiences in the caves, and that's how he knew, because he'd had access to the thought records when he visited the caves. So he said something which kind of tied in with psychological theory of the time, people like Jung and the like. He said, this is a racial memory story that somehow Richard Shaver has, remembered from deep racial memory. In the follow-up story, Shaver, I don't know whether Palmer or Shaver wrote it, but the introduction of the follow-up story, Shaver comes clean and says, this wasn't racial memory. This was, I've had access to the thought records because I've been in the caves. And that was kind of where it totally blew up, because then you have somebody saying, not only is this some ancient story, this stuff's still going on, and I still have contact with the Darrow and the Terro. And I've lived with them in the caves for 8 years or 10 years or however long, he said he lived in the caves.
It is, Susie, are you still there?
I am. I'm following.
Okay, good.
It's a lot to follow. It's crazy.
I can just see smoke coming out of your ears right now, and we're just scratching the surface. I mean, this has so many levels and so many legs. Remember Charles Marcou, Caux, who was going to go into the Blowing Cave in Arkansas because he was convinced he had this map where he could connect with the Tarot. And he talked about being in Flint, Michigan, on Christmas Eve in the 40s. I even went to the street that he's supposed to have been on in Flint, Michigan, and one of the streets is not there anymore. It has so much changed. But I did not encounter any Tarot. I can say that. But this is just such a fascinating story. I think people, if they want to delve into this, they should probably start with Richard Toronto's don't you think?
Absolutely. War Over Lemuria and Shaverology, the follow-up. Those books are they made what I'm doing now, and I'm making the documentary. They made it possible. Richard Toronto he'd really paved the way for so much that I do. For example, because of his book, where he talks about a cafe in Wisconsin, where in Amherst, where Ray Palmer would go every morning. I seeked it out, and it was still there, and I got it just before it closed. It's closed now. The cafe it was still run by the same family, Catherine Flemings, and the mother of the current owner, or what was the current owner, I had a meeting with her. She's lovely, and I'll still interview her. She's agreed to it. I haven't shot that interview yet, but she remembered Ray Palmer coming in because she worked for her mother in the cafe, and she was one of the waitresses, I guess. And they still had memories of Palmer coming in, because obviously Ray Palmer's business, when he moved to Amherst, was still magazines and was still books. So he would go to the post office every morning, I'm assuming, to get orders and then to ship out books. On his way to the post office, he would stop at Fleming's Cafe every single morning, And this is Richard Toronto let me know this. So as soon as I read it, I'm like, what's left in Amherst? Well, Fleming's Cafe is still there. Let's go there and talk to the people there. So again, anybody who's interested should read War Over Lemuria. It's one of the most influential books in my life, meaning that it's guided me so far on what I'm doing at the moment.
And what it does, it goes through uh, uh, Ray Palmer's life and Richard Shaver's life from the beginning, from the very beginnings, and you see how both these men, regardless of what one thinks about the Shaver mystery, any validity to it or not, these men both overcame major adversity in their lives, and that really is a message that comes through in that book.
Well, I think that
Yeah, I was going to ask, how much do we know about Shaver as a person?
Well, thanks to Richard Toronto, we know an awful lot, because Richard Toronto used to run a fanzine called Shavertron, and you can still
Yes.
buy the collected editions of Shavertron as well, by the way. He was in communication with Richard Shaver before Richard Shaver passed in 1975. So thanks to Richard Toronto, we have this wonderful, far deeper understanding of Shaver than we would have had otherwise. And so Shaver was this character who was incredibly sincere in, I think, everything that he ever wrote. And he talked about these experiences with these non-human races I mentioned, or humanoid but non-human race below the earth, two of them, the Darrow and the Terror. But we also know that Richard Shaver, as again, Steve's talked about this extensively in the interview I did with him for my documentary, which is fantastic. But we know that Richard Shaver had psychological problems and was institutionalized for much of the period that he said he was living with the Terror and the Darrow under the earth. Now, the question, of course, becomes, can you reconcile those things? That he had these experiences, but at the time he was living with this subterranean races, that he was actually in mental institutions. And Ray Palmer would say yes. Ray Palmer's solution to that was there was a 19th century biblical or Bible, I shouldn't say biblical, a 19th century New Age, essentially what we say New Age Bible, called a Waspi. And a Waspi talked about various levels of different spiritual beings that interacted with us, malevolent and benevolent. And it was Rog Phillips, who I mentioned before, another writer for Amazing Stories, who introduced Ray Palmer, I believe, to a Waspi. And Ray Palmer thought that Richard Shaver's experiences were real, but they weren't necessarily contained within the physical world. So when Richard Shaver was catatonic, as Ray Palmer said, when he was in these institutions, he was actually genuinely at another spiritual level where he was having experiences with these non-human entities. Now, Richard Shaver, to give Shaver's perspective, said that's nonsense. All of this was real and it was physical and it wasn't this, alternative mamby-pamby reality. The Darrow are real, the tech's real, the machines are real. And he'd been guided out of prison and other things by the Tarot, by his Tarot lover, and taken down into the underground area and actually lived with them. But Palmer had a unique gift and a unique talent of being able to reconcile the real with the unreal. And perhaps the greatest example of this is when he was a baby. Palmer always claimed to have complete recollection of everything since he was born. And he claimed when he was a baby, he could remember his grandmother holding him up to the kitchen window in the house in Milwaukee and showing him Halley's Comet. He was 100% sure that he'd seen that. And later, as he admits in his own autobiography, in The Secret World, in The Martian Diary, which is part of The Secret World, which people can go and buy this old hardcover edition still on Amazon, or maybe on eBay if they look around and get it for a good price. He said that he is 100% sure that he saw Halley's Comet, but he also recognizes later that people said, well, you were still in in utero. You were still in your mother's womb when Halley's Comet had moved out of any ability for a human being to see. But he was able to say, well, it's weird because they tell me that and I believe that. I don't argue with it, but I know I saw Halley's Comet. So Raymond Palmer was able to reconcile the real with the unreal. And to him, it wasn't this kind of modern positivistic world. It was far more of this Fortean reality that extended beyond the realms of current science. And it's one of the reasons Ray Palmer was probably one of the people most responsible for keeping the ideas of Charles Fort alive, because in Amazing Stories, he was constantly talking about Charles Fort in the leading science fiction magazine on the planet, which he edited. And throughout the rest of his career, he was constantly talking about Charles Fort. So he had no problems reconciling what he knew was a fact with what he knew was a memory.
Fascinating stuff. And also, and it's on the side in that 4-volume set of Shavertron, which is also fascinating. In the 3rd volume, I believe it is, Richard Toronto scored an interview with John Keel.
It's so good.
And yes, it is. And it's where he reveals that he used the term ultra terrestrial as kind of a literary device, and he borrowed it from Ivan Sanderson, the great British naturalist. But I got the impression that that Keel was actually angry with Shaver, because I think as a kid, this is the impression I got, that he was reading those stories and they scared the hell out of him.
It's funny because it is funny because Keel was aggressive in some of his descriptions of, or his dismissal of, the Shaver mystery. And I'm not saying whether the Shaver mystery is real or unreal. Part of the documentary, again a spoiler, is a wonderful bit from Joshua Cutchin where he says that some people dismiss all of this as fiction and some people believe all of this is totally real, talking about the Shaver mystery. And Cutchin says that he walks a line in between because he realizes how this feeds into, far older and far more significant traditions, or words to that extent. And I think that Keel, I think, to be honest, I think Keel's approach to Shaver was unfair. And I think you might be right, Steve. I think maybe it has something to do with the annoyance it had when he was younger, because I'm not sure what Shaver experienced or not. The only thing I'm sure of was that Shaver was 100% sincere. I don't doubt that Richard Shaver was absolutely sincere with what he experienced, whether it was real, whether it was madness, whether it wasn't. But Keel was normally far more flexible in his approach to what people experienced. And he wasn't that flexible with Shaver for some reason.
And you can understand how some of this stuff, if people took it to heart, would scare the living daylights out of them.
It's terrifying.
But yeah, that was pretty funny. And I just had, I've done it again. I had this great thought, Dean, that I was going to expound on, and now I've just lost
all
it.
the time. Yeah, no, I know it happens to me all the time.
It'll come back. But I know what it was. The one thing about Shaver is that whatever was going on with him. Now we know that Richard Toronto gives the example of James Tilly Matthews, who was the Welsh tea merchant, who back in the late 1700s, he believed he had kind of a delusion or a mythology like Shaver did. He believed that there was this heirloom gang, which was really some kind of a bizarre complex device with baffles and sails and so forth, pneumatically operated, air operated, that would send out rays and was controlling him, just like the Darrow were sending out rays trying to mess with Shaver. And so that, there was that. But
the influencing machine is the psychological description for that belief.
Yes, exactly. But Shaver was tapped into something. It was sort of like a channeling thing. He would get this information would flow through. And we both talked about how, I was telling Susy before we came on about how Ray Palmer went to Bartow, Pennsylvania when he was getting this correspondence from Shaver. He wanted to see what this guy was all about. And of course, Ray Palmer is sleeping in the room next to Shaver and his wife. And he starts hearing this conversation. and there's different people, and supposedly something terrible had happened, and Ray Palmer interjected himself in this conversation, and he was basically told to shut up. Later on, he revealed that the voices were coming from Richard Shaver as he slept. And you have a story about that with Ray Palmer's daughter, right?
Well, yeah, Ray Palmer's daughter, and this is also in one of the Richard Toronto books. It might be in Shaverology, which is, if you read War Over Lemuria, and I recommend everybody with any interest in the unusual or the weird reads that book. It's one of my favorite books I've ever read. He has a companion book called Shaverology, and in that book he has, I think Linda wrote it and sent it to Richard Toronto for publication in the book. But Richard, and I also know that Raymond Palmer, Ray Palmer's son, also remembers similar things, is that when Richard Shaver came to Christmas dinner and to other dinners, as they often did, because the Palmers and the Shavers, again, I talked about them clearly being so close, they moved to rural, middle of nowhere Wisconsin at the same time. When he would lay down on a couch, at least on one occasion, maybe more, when he would fall asleep, he would start to have a conversation with something else. And the sounds that came out of Richard Shaver's mouth weren't his own. There were other things talking. And you could say, well, maybe that's just Shaver having some kind of weird, I don't know, hypnagogic or hypnopomnic fantasy, and he's talking to himself. But it seems far eerier and far creepier than that. And as a very quick aside, this is only something I just bumped into recently. I was listening to David Paulides' YouTube videos, and Paulides is, I think, one of the modern researchers that interests me most. Whether that's because what he's saying is correct, or whether it's because it's just a well-told narrative, I'm
and of
not even
course,
100% sure.
he's the one that has written the Missing 411 books that discusses
Absolutely.
bizarre disappearances. Go ahead.
Absolutely. And so he was talking recently, and it was a couple of months ago. He was talking about disappearances in Pennsylvania, which is of course is where Richard Shaver was when he first started having some of these kind of experiences, and also in Michigan, which is nearby. And one of the towns that Shaver talked about, one of the towns that Paulides had talked about, Shaver had actually lived in, and he tracked two other people who had those weird missing 411 type disappearances from this town that Shaver also had lived in. And so then you look at it and you go, okay, so Paulides himself, who's obviously somebody with his finger on the pulse of the history of missing people in this country, perhaps on this planet, is pointing to this town as something weird's going on here. And then you go back and you track and you go, Shaver lived in that town. And I don't know what to even make of that, to be honest. And when I heard it, and I went, I think Shaver lived there. And I went and looked away, and sure enough, it was one of the places that Shaver lived in. I'm not even sure what you make of that. You know what I mean? Like it's so strange.
And I'm trying to think, Susie, weren't you and I talking or writing about the Kelly Hopkinsville goblins? And I, I just lost his name. Who was born there? The uh,
Edgar Case.
Edgar Casey, the prophet. Yes, the
Yep.
modern day prophet. Yes.
I was
So
thinking about him as you were talking about Shaver talking in his sleep. Sounded an awful lot like that. And it makes sense. You have different brain waves when you're asleep. So it might be, easier for something to channel through you.
That's fascinating. And that's something I think Keel looked over with Shaver. I think Keel dismissed Shaver more readily than he dismissed other people that he dealt with. And I don't think that's fair. Whether Shaver really, again, had these experiences or not, I wouldn't be dismissing Shaver as quickly as Keel did.
right. There's definitely something to it. Now, I kind of doubt that there is this degenerate race hiding in caverns with all. I hope not anyway.
I hope
But
not too, because I'm not that far. At least it's no, the Tero are nice, so they're not too far away from me.
but if I ever in some kind of a large skyscraper in a big city, I'm not going to press the ground button twice.
That's right. You don't press it. It's the basement button twice, I think.
Basement
By the way.
button. That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
You don't hit that twice, or it'll go down, and you'll go down again, and and that's again in the wonderful Long John Nebel show you were talking about.
So when do you have any idea when this documentary will be ready? I
Well,
know
you
that's
know what?
probably not a fair question, but
Well, it is fair because it's taking me longer than I hoped. I will say this: I have one extract of the documentary, and I've edited far more than that, but I have one extract of the documentary just called The Shaver Mystery. And there's three parts of the Shaver Mysteries in the documentary. So this would be the Shaver Mystery part one. But I am starting to festival that section now just to get kind of a buzz about the documentary. So I did play that at Midwest Weird Fest. I've in the history of 20 years almost of me running festivals, I've only played 3 of my films. And I did play that short this year and I got some positive feedback. And I'm about to start sending out the Shaver Mystery, which you feature heavily in, by the way, Steve. I'm going to start sending that extract out because it stands alone to festivals this year. I hope to finish shooting the documentary this year. And I would like to think by next year the entire documentary, The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers, will be finished. But people maybe will be able to see at least an extract of it at a festival, hopefully near them
well,
sometime this
that's.
year.
I'm really looking forward to it. This is a story that I'm so glad you're working on this because I don't want this to be lost. If you simply look at it as some kind of interesting pop culture or footnote in history or whatever, or something monumental, it's something that needs to be told and preserved.
I couldn't agree more. And it's fascinating. I mean,
Yes.
the the magazine that it was first published in was of course called Amazing Stories, but the story of Richard Shaver and Raymond Palmer and their ongoing relationship is the most amazing story I've ever heard. Like it's phenomenal. And you kind of teed into it a little bit before when you said they both gone through hardships. I think Richard Shaver's psychological hardships and Raymond Palmer's physical hardships, which we didn't talk about. But I think when those two people came together, it was like dynamite. It was like mixing two incredibly potent chemicals together, and then the sum becomes more than the parts. And the mythological explosion, however real or not real it is, because mythology doesn't necessarily mean it's not real, but the mythological explosion that came out of that meeting is probably one of the most significant in the entire modern period.
And the whole thing may have been set off by the fact that Ray Palmer and Howard Brown, the other editor, didn't really get along. So when Howard Brown had
Mhm.
found that alphabet that Shaver sent, he called him a crackpot, wadded it up, threw it in the basket, and I think probably just to spite Howard Brown, Ray Palmer pulled it out and unraveled it and printed it.
You know what? It's funny because you're right. And in Richard Toronto's War over Lemuria, he lists 5 reasons. Like he's like, why did Ray? There's different theories on why Ray Palmer wanted to go ahead and publish it. And one of them is to teach, to teach Brown a lesson. Another one is because he knew it was, going to be like, commercial dynamite. But and the third one might be because he believed in the underdog. The fourth one might be because he thought it might have been real, and the fifth one was because all 4 of the above. And I think maybe it was all 4 of the above. I think Palmer was canny, but he also was a true believer. I think he thought the world was far weirder than most people were ever comfortable to accept it as.
And he would say, flying saucers are here to make us think.
You know what? You're so dead right. And the funny thing is, the very first time I met his son, also called Ray Palmer, Raymond B. Palmer instead of Raymond A. Palmer,
Yeah, that's
I
great.
I hadn't been able to get a hold of him. I was driving past his house after I'd been in Amherst filming a Memorial Day parade last year, drove past his residence and saw him outside gardening, and I thought, that's Ray Palmer's son. And I pulled in and we had a conversation. And one of the very first things he told me is exactly what you said then. He was like, Dad always thought flying saucers were here to make us think.
Very good. Susie, any closing comments or thoughts?
I think I have my new rabbit hole to go down after hearing all of this.
Just don't get too far into the caverns, whatever you do. Well, Dana, I think we'll wrap it up here. We could just go on, and I'll love to have you come back because there's so much. You're really fascinating, and the work you've done. I just love to hear you talk about your research and the things that you've discovered.
Anytime, my friend. And we need to get you back on Talking Weird in the near future as well.
Sounds really good. So I guess tell us how we can get a hold of you, how people can contact you.
Well, if they're interested in the documentary, they can go to theshavermystery.com, which is pretty easy to remember, theshavermystery.com. And that just at the moment takes you to the Facebook page for the man who invented flying saucers. You can always also find me, Dean Bertram, pretty easily on Facebook. My two festivals are www.midwestweirdfest.com or anightofhorror.com. So it's easy to contact me through those as well. And please, every Tuesday night at 9 p.m., I go live on the 9 p.m. Central, I should say. Not everybody's in my time zone. I go live on the Untold Radio Network with Talking Weird, and you can easily find that on YouTube, or you just go to untoldradio.am.com, I believe is the website. Anyway, it's pretty easy to find us out there. So I hope people who listen to your show come and listen to mine sometime as well. And I hope to have you on sometime, Steve. And we should also get you on Talking Weird sometime, Susie.
I'd love to.
She's a great guest, by the way. There's nothing dull or boring about Susie.
I can tell. It'll be fantastic. Let's do that soon, Susie. And let's get you back soon too, Steve, because it's been at least like 3 or 4 months since I've had you on. So it's time to get you back as well.
I'd love to. It's wonderful being on your show. One thing before I talk to Susie again, and before we go, was it Ed Johns? Is that the guy that lived up north of San Francisco and had all that bizarre stuff go on his property? It's in the Shaver Home Companion. The guy that talked about black cars and some kind of a creatures trying to get in the door. And I mean, the thing is, I just want to mention it briefly. It's like a lot of the stuff like black cars and mysterious visitors and creatures, again, predating the modern day Men in Black and UFOs and so forth, all happened supposedly to this guy who was a dwarf, I think, Ed Johns. And he corresponded with Palmer, and that the story is fascinating. So people need to check out A Shaver Home Companion as well.
Yeah, and that should be my close, because my film's not done, and I think anybody who's interested in this type of material, who's only heard about it tonight, if you want to discover more, go and check out Richard Toronto's War Over Lemuria, or Richard Toronto's Shaverology, or Richard Toronto's I think there's 4 or 5 volumes of Shavertron, and he also has the Rock Fogo 2-volume companion, which is gorgeous and has all of. We didn't even get into that, and we can't tonight. Maybe we can another time. Richard Shaver's rock art, where he was discovering rocks in the ground, which he believed he could cut into pieces, and he could look at these samples and he could see messages from ancient civilizations before us. And the Rock Fogo books are gorgeous. But just go and look up Richard Toronto on Amazon, and you'll find all of his books, and every single one is worth reading.
Excellent. And thank you again, Dean. And Susie, thank you for so much for being here tonight.
It's my pleasure.
And everybody sit tight. I'll do the closeout. The High Strangeness Factor was created by Steve Ward and Andy Mercer and is copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I want to thank our fearless leaders here at the network, Iron Allen Block, Mark Johnson, and Andy Mercer. Also, Andy Mercer as producer and composer of the closing theme. Brian Zeller as composer for the opening theme for the High Strangeness Factor. I can also be heard on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files on this same network and many other platforms. And I am Steve Ward, your humble host here on the High Strangeness Factor, a displaced Michigander, deep in the Ohio Valley in West by God, Virginia, inches from downtown Point Pleasant, living on the same road that the Mothman chased automobiles in the mid-60s. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you all again. Andy and I will see you all again in a fortnight. Take care.